Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, February 9, 1971, Close Combat Training Hall 7, 1:47 in the afternoon. 200 Marines stood around the edge of the training floor when Chuck Norris walked through the double doors. He did not arrive in uniform, he did not carry equipment, he wore a fitted black long-sleeve shirt, dark trousers and simple black shoes. His hair was short, his expression was calm, he looked smaller than almost every man in the room. The base commander introduced him as one of the most discussed martial artists in America, a man known for speed, a man known for Jeet Kune Do, a man whose demonstrations had brought fighters, actors, instructors, and athletes into the same room just to see whether the stories were true. Most of the Marines watched with interest, one did not. Staff Sergeant Dax Harlan stood near the back wall with his arms folded across his chest. He was 34 years old, 6'2", 230 lb. He had boxed for the Marine Corps. He had served 2 tours overseas. He had trained recruits in close combat for 6 years. Nobody on the base had beaten him in a full-contact sparring round in more than 4 years. The men called him Stone Harlan, not because he was impossible to hurt, because he never admitted when something hurt. He watched Chuck cross the floor and smiled, not with respect, with amusement. The commander finished the introduction. The invitation had been arranged weeks earlier. Chuck was not there to replace the base instructors or redesign Marine training. The commander wanted the men to see a different approach from a martial artist whose name had begun spreading far beyond traditional schools. That distinction mattered to the commander. It did not matter to Harlan. He had spent years watching visitors arrive with polished language, clean uniforms, and techniques that failed the moment resistance became real. He had seen men impress a room for 10 minutes and disappear before anyone could ask them to prove more. To him, Chuck looked like another name carried by reputation. The Marines around Harlan knew that expression. They had seen it before difficult drills, before boxing rounds, and before Harlan stepped onto a mat with someone who had been talking too confidently. It meant he had already decided what the other man was. Chuck noticed that, too, he did not see hatred. He saw a conclusion formed before observation. That was more dangerous because Harlan believed it was experience. Chuck stepped on to the center mat. "I was invited here as a guest," he said, "not to tell Marines how to be Marines." A few men smiled. Chuck continued, "I was asked to show how I think about distance, timing, and interception." Harlan spoke from the back. "That is a long way of saying hitting first." Several Marines turned. The commander looked toward him. "Staff Sergeant." Harlan lifted both hands. "I am listening, sir." Chuck looked at him. Harlan's smile remained. Chuck turned back to the group. "Sometimes hitting first is the answer." Harlan spoke again. "Sometimes the other man does not stand still while you explain it." The room became quieter. The commander took one step forward. "Harlan, that is enough." Chuck raised one hand. "It is all right." Harlan pushed away from the wall. He walked toward the mat slowly. The Marines opened a path for him. He wore an olive-drab t-shirt, utility trousers, and black combat boots. His shoulders were wide. His hands were scarred. A pale line ran across his left cheekbone from a training accident 3 years earlier. He moved like a man who expected people to make room. He stopped 10 feet from Chuck. "What do you call it?" Harlan asked. "Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist." "Yes," Harlan looked around the room. "That sounds good." He looked back at Chuck. "Everything sounds good when the other man is helping." The Marines watched Chuck. Chuck did not answer immediately. Harlan continued, "I have seen demonstrations. One man throws the punch he was told to throw, the other man knows where it is going, then everybody claps because the answer was already decided." Chuck looked at the men standing around the mat, then at Harlan. "Would you like to throw a punch I did not choose?" A few Marines laughed. Harlan did not. "I would like more than one." Section 3. The Agreement. The commander stepped between them. "This is a guest appearance, not a challenge match." Harlan looked past him, then let him demonstrate. Chuck's expression did not change. Harlan pointed toward the center of the mat. "1 round, no student, no assistant, no planned attack." He pointed at Chuck. "Just you and me." The hall became silent. The commander turned to Chuck. "You do not have to answer that." Chuck nodded. "I know." Harlan folded his arms again. "You came here because people know your name." Chuck looked at him. "You think that is why?" "I think cameras made you famous. There are no cameras here." Harlan smiled. Exactly, that was the first moment the room truly changed. The Marines were no longer watching a demonstration, they were watching one of their own men challenge a guest in front of the entire unit. Harlan took another step. Movie speed, movie punches, movie students. Chuck remained still. Harlan pointed at the mat. Try it on someone who hits back. The commander's voice became harder. Staff Sergeant Harlan, stand down. Harlan did not look away from Chuck. Sir, with respect, he came here because he is supposed to be the real thing. The commander answered, he came here because I invited him. Harlan nodded. Then let him leave as a guest. He looked directly at Chuck. But do not let him leave pretending that was fighting. The words entered the room and stayed there. Chuck looked around at the Marines. Some expected him to refuse, some expected him to become angry. Harlan expected both. Chuck removed his black jacket and folded it over a wooden bench. Then he stepped onto the center of the mat. You want one round? Harlan's smile returned. One round, no demonstration, no planned attack. Harlan shook his head. You will not know what is coming. Chuck looked at him. Neither will you. The first row of Marines reacted. Harlan walked toward the edge of the mat and removed his watch. The commander caught his arm. You will follow the rules. Harlan looked down at the hand. What rules? No eye attacks, no throat attacks, no strikes after a man is down. I stop it when I say stop. Harlan nodded once. The commander turned to Chuck. The same. Chuck nodded. Section 4. They face each other. Harlan stepped onto the mat. The size difference became clearer when they stood together. Harlan was nearly 7 in taller and 90 lb heavier. His forearms looked built to break grips. His boots were planted wide. He carried the confidence of a man who had controlled training rooms for years. Chuck stood lightly, his hands were open, his shoulders were relaxed. Harlan looked at the stance and laughed. That is it? Chuck answered. You have not moved yet. The commander raised one hand. 1 round, 3 minutes. Harlan glanced toward the men around the mat. You will not need 3. Chuck heard him. So you have said. Before the first movement, the room held 2 different ideas of what was about to happen. Harlan believed the round would separate performance from reality. In his mind, Chuck had built a reputation around controlled demonstrations, cooperative partners, and audiences that wanted to believe. Chuck saw something simpler. A trained man stood across from him with real speed, real strength, and years of experience under pressure. Harlan was not a fool, he was not a beginner, he was dangerous because he had solved the same kind of problem many times and had begun believing every problem was the same. The Marines around the mat understood Harlan's power. Many had felt it personally. He had dropped them, pinned them, corrected them, and ordered them back up. They trusted his toughness because they had seen it at close range. Almost none of them had seen Chuck fight freely. That uncertainty belonged to the whole room. Harlan mistook it for an advantage. Chuck treated it as silence. Then the commander dropped his hand. Begin, Section 5. The first exchanges. Harlan moved first. He did not throw a wide punch. He stepped in behind a fast left jab aimed at Chuck's face. Chuck shifted half a step. The jab missed. Harlan followed with a straight right. Chuck turned his shoulder and let the punch pass. Harlan immediately hooked toward the ribs. Chuck moved outside the arc. 3 attacks, no contact. Harlan stopped. The room remained quiet. He had expected Chuck to retreat quickly. Chuck had barely moved. Harlan raised his hands again. Good. Chuck watched him. Was that the demonstration? A few Marines laughed. Harlan's face tightened. He stepped forward with another jab. This time he used it to hide a low kick toward Chuck's lead leg. Chuck lifted the leg, avoided the kick, and touched Harlan's chest with the heel of his palm, not hard, only enough to stop the forward movement. Harlan looked down at the hand. Chuck removed it. You were open. Harlan swung a short right hand from close range. Chuck intercepted the forearm before the punch formed. His other hand touched Harlan's ribs. Then Chuck moved away. The exchange took less than a second. Several Marines leaned forward. Harlan turned. Touching is not fighting. Chuck answered. You asked me to intercept. Harlan rushed. He threw a left toward the head, a right toward the body, and stepped in to grab. Chuck avoided the first, redirected the second, but Harlan's left arm closed around his shoulder. The Marines reacted. Harlan drove forward. He used his weight to push Chuck toward the wall. This was where he wanted the fight. No open distance, no room for speed, only size, leverage, and pressure. Chuck's back came within 3 feet of the padded wall. Harlan tightened the hold. "You cannot dance now." Chuck struck the inside of Harlan's arm with one hand. The grip shifted. He stepped across Harlan's lead foot, turned his hips, and disappeared from the line of pressure. Harlan hit the wall shoulder first. The impact echoed through the hall. Chuck stood behind him. Section 6. The room changes. The first escape changed the way the Marines watched. Until then, many of them had expected speed. Speed was part of the story around Chuck Norris. They were prepared to see quick hands and sharp movement. They were not prepared to see a man of Harlan's size redirected with so little effort. Harlan had not been thrown by strength. He had driven himself into the wall because Chuck had changed the line at the exact moment the pressure became complete. The difference was small, the result was not. Several Marines near the front looked down at Harlan's feet. They were trying to understand what Chuck had seen. Harlan noticed them looking. That irritated him. He had built his authority around being the man who explained why other people failed. Now his own men were studying him as an example. He raised his hands and moved again. This time there was less mockery in his face, more attention that made him more dangerous. Harlan had real experience. Once he stopped performing for the room, his balance improved, his punches shortened. He stopped reaching for Chuck's head and began closing the exits first. Chuck had wanted him to become honest. Honesty did not make the fight easier, it made the threat clearer. Harlan turned quickly. The Marines were no longer smiling. The commander watched closely. Harlan rolled one shoulder. "You moved." Chuck answered. That was the idea. Harlan attacked again. This time he did not chase Chuck's head. He closed distance behind both forearms and forced him toward the edge of the mat. Chuck moved left. Harlan cut him off. Chuck moved right. Harlan stepped across the path. The Marine was learning. He understood pressure. He understood how to make a smaller man run out of space. Harlan drove a heavy punch toward the body. Chuck blocked most of it. Not all. The strike touched his ribs and moved him sideways. The Marines shouted. Harlan smiled. There, Chuck touched the place once. Harlan advanced. That is what happens when the other man hits back. Chuck looked at him. You landed part of one. Harlan's smile disappeared. Section 7, lifted off the floor. He attacked with more force, a jab, a right hand, a hook. Chuck moved through the spaces between them. The jab missed by an inch. The right passed over his shoulder. The hook struck Chuck's raised forearm. Harlan used the contact to grab. His hands closed around Chuck's upper arms. He lifted. Chuck's shoes left the mat. Harlan carried him 2 steps and drove him toward the padded wall. The crowd of Marines shouted. Harlan pinned Chuck with his body. Now the size difference mattered completely. Chuck's arms were trapped, his back pressed against the wall. Harlan leaned close. No room. Chuck looked down. Harlan's feet were planted wide, too wide. Chuck lowered his weight, turned one shoulder and struck the inside of Harlan's thigh with his knee. The Marine's base shifted. Chuck struck the ribs with a short palm, then the chest. Harlan's grip loosened. Chuck dropped to the floor. Before Harlan could close again, Chuck stepped behind the lead foot and turned. Harlan lost balance. He went down onto one hand and one knee. The room exploded. Harlan stayed there for 1 second. Then he stood. His face had changed. The fight was no longer a test of Jeet Kune Do. It was now a test of his authority. Every Marine in the room had seen him forced to one knee. Harlan looked at Chuck. You think that counts? Chuck answered, you went down. Harlan charged. Section 8, full power, the commander shouted. Control it. Harlan did not hear him. He threw the right hand with full power. Chuck moved outside and struck the body. Harlan turned with the left. Chuck ducked and kicked the front thigh. Harlan's legs stiffened. He swung again. Chuck stepped in before the punch opened. One hand stopped the biceps. The other struck the chest. Harlan stumbled back 1 step. He recovered immediately and fired a short uppercut. Chuck leaned away. The fist passed close enough to move his hair. The Marine saw the danger. Harlan was not slow. He was trained. His punches were compact. His feet stayed beneath him. He understood how to fight under pressure. Chuck understood something else. Harlan's right shoulder tightened before every power strike. His front foot turned outward before every attempt to drive forward. When his pride was touched, he stopped protecting the body. Chuck began working there, a short kick to the thigh, a straight hand to the chest, a compact strike beneath the ribs. Then he moved. Harlan chased. Chuck stopped him with a kick to the hip. Harlan forced through it. Chuck hit the body again. Harlan grabbed at the shirt. Chuck slipped free. The Marines started reacting to every movement. Some shouted for Harlan. More began shouting for Chuck. Harlan heard it. That made him reckless. He stepped forward and slapped his own chest. "Stand here." Chuck remained where he was. Harlan pointed at the floor between them. "No running, no tricks. Stand here and fight." Chuck looked at the marked spot, then at Harlan. "You want me where you are strongest." Harlan smiled. "Afraid?" "No." Chuck stepped onto the spot. The room became silent. Section 9, the second takedown. Harlan moved in. He threw the left jab. Chuck redirected it. The right followed. Chuck slipped inside. Harlan tried to close both arms around him. Chuck struck the ribs twice. Harlan's elbows dropped. Chuck hit the center of the chest. Harlan threw a hook from close range. Chuck intercepted it at the forearm. He struck beneath the chin with the heel of his hand. Harlan's head snapped back. Chuck kicked behind the lead knee. Harlan dropped to one knee again. This time the room did not explode immediately. It went silent. The strongest man in the unit was kneeling in front of the guest he had mocked. Chuck stood close enough to strike. He did not. Harlan looked up. Chuck stepped back. "Get up." Harlan's eyes hardened. He rose. The commander moved closer. "That is enough." Harlan raised one hand. "No." He looked at Chuck. "He has not finished anything." Chuck answered, "You are the one asking to continue." Harlan breathed through his mouth. His chest rose quickly. A dark mark had begun forming along one side of his ribs. He looked at the Marines around the mat. Men he had trained, men he had corrected, men he had thrown to the floor and ordered back up. They were watching him wait for permission to continue. Harlan could not accept that. One more exchange. The commander shook his head. "The round is still running." Harlan looked toward the clock. Only 1 minute and 22 seconds had passed. He had believed the challenge would last less than 30. Chuck had already put him down twice. Section 10. The Grazing Punch. Harlan raised his hands. Chuck waited. This time Harlan did not rush. He circled. He tested the distance with the left. Chuck did not bite. Harlan stepped outside Chuck's lead foot. He used a feint toward the body and drove the right toward the head. Chuck moved just enough. The punch grazed his temple. A sound moved through the room. Harlan followed with a shoulder and forced Chuck backward. He trapped one arm and tried to turn behind him. Chuck shifted, but Harlan maintained the grip. The Marine locked both hands around Chuck's waist from the side. He lifted. Chuck's feet left the floor again. Harlan turned toward the mat. He intended to throw him hard enough to end the discussion. The commander moved forward. Chuck hooked one leg around Harlan's knee. He struck the side of the neck with an open palm. Harlan's grip weakened. Chuck shifted his weight. Both men fell. Harlan hit first. Chuck rolled free. The impact echoed through the building. Harlan tried to rise immediately. His right leg failed. He caught himself with one hand. Chuck stood several feet away. Harlan looked at the leg, then at Chuck. The humiliation reached him before the pain. He forced himself upright. The Marines had become completely quiet. Harlan's face was red. His breathing was heavy. Chuck's black shirt was stretched at one shoulder. A red mark showed near his temple. He was breathing harder now, too. The fight had not been effortless. That mattered. Harlan was dangerous. He had touched Chuck. He had lifted him twice. One successful throw could have changed everything. But he had not controlled a single full exchange. Every time he believed he had Chuck trapped, Chuck had used the trap against him. Harlan raised his fists again. Section 11. The commander steps in. The commander stepped onto the mat. "Staff Sergeant, stop." Harlan looked at him. "Sir, that is an order." Harlan's jaw tightened. Then Chuck spoke. "Let him finish." The commander turned. Chuck watched Harlan. He asked for one round. Harlan nodded. The commander stepped back slowly. "One more uncontrolled strike, and I stop it." Harlan did not answer. Chuck lowered his hand slightly. Harlan saw it as an opening. He moved a fast jab. Chuck slipped. A hard right. Chuck moved outside. Harlan kicked toward the thigh. Chuck lifted the leg. Harlan followed with a left hook. Chuck blocked. The Marine pressed forward behind the contact. and finally drove Chuck against the padded wall. This time he did not reach for a wide grip. He used one forearm across Chuck's chest and struck short with the other hand. The first punch hit the body, the second touched the shoulder, the third never formed. Chuck trapped the wrist, he turned the elbow, Harlan's posture broke. Chuck stepped away from the wall and pulled Harlan forward. The Marine stumbled, Chuck struck the body, then the thigh, then the chest. Harlan backed away for the first time. The Marines saw it. Harlan saw them seeing it. He roared and rushed again. Chuck intercepted him with a sidekick to the center of the body. The impact stopped Harlan completely. His boots slid backward across the mat. The room erupted. Harlan bent slightly and tried to breathe. Chuck remained in front of him. "You called it a trick." Harlan straightened. "You have not beaten me." Chuck looked at the clock. 1 minute left. Section 12. Harlan becomes real. Harlan's best sequence came after he stopped trying to prove that Chuck was a fraud. He stepped into range behind the jab and did not overextend. Chuck moved outside, but Harlan had already placed the lead foot across the escape. The right hand drove toward the body. Chuck blocked. The impact still moved him. Harlan followed with his shoulder and forced him backward. The Marines reacted. For the first time, Harlan did not chase the reaction. He kept his elbows close and moved with patience. A short left touched the ribs. A forearm blocked Chuck from turning out. The wall came closer. Chuck watched the change. Harlan was finally using what he actually knew instead of what his pride demanded. The next exchange became the most dangerous of the round. Harlan pinned one side with his shoulder and attacked the body with compact punches. Chuck absorbed one on the arm and another across the ribs. The third strike almost reached the jaw. Chuck moved inside the punch before it completed. His forehead came close to Harlan's chest. One hand controlled the attacking arm. The other struck beneath the ribs. Harlan tightened his stance. Chuck hit the same point again. The Marine's breath broke. Chuck turned beneath the shoulder and escaped. Harlan followed immediately. No anger, no shout, just pressure. Chuck kicked the thigh. Harlan accepted it and kept moving. Chuck struck the chest. Harlan gave one step and returned. For several seconds, neither man controlled the entire exchange. The Marines saw something important. Harlan had not become harmless simply because his certainty was wrong. He remained disciplined, strong, and capable of ending the round. Chuck's advantage was not that the Marine had no answers. It was that Chuck continued seeing the question sooner. Section 13. Final 30 seconds. Harlan wiped sweat from his mouth. Then, use it. He stepped forward more carefully. For the first time, he respected the distance. He kept his elbows closer. He did not overreach. The Marine could see him adjusting. Chuck could too. Harlan jabbed toward the chest. Chuck parried. The right followed lower. Chuck turned. Harlan did not chase. He stepped across the escape and fired the left hook. Chuck blocked, but the force moved him. Harlan hit the body. The punch landed clean enough to make Chuck exhale. Several Marines shouted. Harlan pressed a short right toward the jaw. Chuck leaned back. The fist missed. Harlan drove the shoulder into him and forced him toward the center. The Marine had found his best moment. He was no longer fighting the insult. He was fighting the man. Chuck recognized the change. He also recognized how late it had come. Harlan attacked with a compact combination. Left, right, left to the body. Chuck redirected the first, slipped the second. The third touched the ribs. Harlan stepped in to grab. Chuck struck the arm, then the body. Harlan kept coming. Chuck kicked the front thigh. Harlan ignored it. He swung the right. Chuck intercepted at the biceps and hit the chest. Harlan staggered but remained standing. He answered with a short left that grazed Chuck's shoulder. The Marines were shouting for both men. The commander watched the clock. The clock did not help Harlan. It exposed him. Every second showed the Marines another thing he had promised would not happen. Chuck was still standing. Harlan had been put down twice. The smaller man had escaped the wall, the lift, the grip, and the pressure. Harlan could feel the unit measuring him now. Not measuring his courage. No one doubted that. They were measuring his judgment. He had called the method useless before testing it. He had mocked the guest before observing him. He had chosen the fight and the rules. Now he had less than half a minute to recover the certainty he had brought onto the mat. That pressure became visible in his face. 30 seconds. Harlan heard it. He looked at Chuck. No more moving. Chuck answered, "Then catch me." Section 14, the final fall. Harlan charged. Chuck met him. The two men collided near the center. Harlan's forearm struck Chuck's guard. Chuck's palm hit the chest. Harlan grabbed the shirt. Chuck struck the ribs. Harlan pulled him close. Chuck hit the body again. Harlan's grip weakened. Chuck turned outside. Harlan caught one arm and tried to drag him back. Chuck stepped with the pull. He struck beneath the jaw. Harlan's head lifted. Chuck hooked behind the knee. Harlan fell onto one hand. He pushed up immediately. Chuck waited. The Marines had stopped shouting. 20 seconds. Harlan stood. His legs shook. He looked at the men around the mat, then at Chuck. He understood that the round was almost over. If he allowed the clock to end it, he could tell himself he had survived. That was not enough. He needed one final attack. He needed one clean moment that could erase everything before it. Harlan drew a breath. Chuck watched the right shoulder tighten. The front foot turned outward. The same signs. The same attack. Only slower now. Harlan rushed. He threw the jab. Chuck brushed it aside. The right hand followed with everything left behind it. Chuck slipped outside. He struck the body. Harlan folded slightly. Chuck hit the center of the chest. Harlan stepped back. Chuck kicked behind the damaged knee. Harlan dropped, but caught himself and forced his body upward again. The Marines gasped. Harlan roared and threw one last hook. Chuck entered before the arm opened. His forearm stopped the biceps. His palm struck beneath the chin. His foot swept the lead leg. Harlan lost balance completely. He hit the mat on his back. The impact shook dust from the edge of the training floor. The commander raised one hand. "Stop!" Chuck stopped. Harlan tried to sit up. His arms moved. His body did not. He turned onto one side. One knee came beneath him. He tried to stand. The leg failed. The entire unit watched. The same man who had called Jeet Kune Do a trick was now on one knee, unable to rise in front of the Marines he trained. Chuck stood several feet away. He did not celebrate. He did not smile. He did not turn toward the crowd. He waited. Harlan tried again. His hand pressed against the mat. His legs shook. He reached a crouch and fell back to one knee. The silence became heavier. Chuck looked at him. "You wanted someone who fights back." Harlan breathed hard. Chuck took one step closer. "Now get up." The words struck harder than an insult. Harlan looked around the room. Every face was turned toward him. He placed one boot flat, then the other. He forced himself upright. He stood unsteadily. Section 15, what the room saw. When Harlan finally stood after the last fall, he looked older than he had 3 minutes earlier. Not weaker, older. The round had removed the expression of a man certain that experience had already given him every answer. He looked at the Marines nearest the mat. Some had trained under him for years. None were laughing. That made the admission possible. He understood that another excuse would damage him more than the defeat itself. The men had seen the full round. They had seen his best moments. They had seen his mistakes. He could not protect his authority by pretending nothing had happened. Real authority now required the one thing he had refused at the beginning: observation without pride. Chuck gave him the space to choose. He did not demand an apology. He did not tell the Marines what to think. He simply waited until Harlan could stand and speak for himself. That restraint made the moment harder. Harlan could not blame humiliation on cruelty. Chuck had given him no insult to fight, only the result. The commander remained ready to step in. Harlan looked at Chuck. His chest rose and fell. A mark had darkened along his ribs. Sweat ran through the scar on his cheekbone. His pride had survived punches before. It had survived throws. It had survived pain. It had never survived being wrong in front of 200 men. Harlan lowered his hands. That was not a demonstration. Chuck waited. Harlan swallowed. "I was wrong." No one moved. Chuck looked at him. "You were certain." Harlan's jaw tightened. Chuck finished. "That is worse." Section 16, the room returns to order. The room remains silent for another second. Then the commander stepped between them. "The round is over." Chuck nodded. Harlan did not. He kept looking at Chuck. Not with friendship, not yet. But the mockery was gone. The commander turned toward the unit. back in formation. The Marines moved slowly at first, then in lines. The room returned to order, but it did not return to what it had been. Before the round, Harlan's authority had filled the hall. Men listened because he had experience, rank, and a record none of them had challenged successfully. After the round, the authority remained, but the myth around it had changed. The Marines had seen him adapt. They had seen him land. They had also seen him become angry, overcommit, and refuse information that did not match what he believed. That made the lesson larger than the fight. A man could be brave and still be wrong. A man could be trained and still become trapped by his own certainty. A man could possess strength and lose control of how he used it. Chuck had not taken Harlan's rank. He had taken away the excuse that rank, size, or experience made observation unnecessary. Section 17. After the doors closed, Chuck walked toward the bench and picked up his jacket. The young Marine nearest him spoke quietly. "Sir," Chuck looked over. "How did you know what he would do?" Chuck looked toward Harlan. "I did not know everything." The Marine waited. "I watched what he gave me." Across the mat, Harlan heard the answer. He sat on the edge of a bench while a corpsman checked his leg and ribs. The corpsman pressed one spot. Harlan winced. "Nothing broken," the corpsman said. Harlan looked toward Chuck. "That is not the problem." The corpsman followed his eyes. "No." The commander approached Chuck near the doors. "I apologize for the way this happened." Chuck put on his jacket. "You invited me as a guest." "I did. He invited me to fight." The commander looked back at Harlan. "He will answer for that." Chuck shook his head. "He already did." The commander almost smiled. "You still have 20 minutes on the schedule." Chuck looked toward the Marines forming again. "They have seen enough." Harlan stood from the bench. His leg remained stiff. He walked toward Chuck. The Marines noticed but stayed in formation. Harlan stopped several feet away. "I have one question." Chuck waited. "When I had you against the wall the second time, why did you not move earlier?" "Because you were still adjusting." Harlan frowned. "You let me improve?" "No." Chuck looked at his feet. "I let you believe the position belonged to you." Harlan looked down. "You waited until I committed." "Yes." Harlan was quiet. "That is the intercepting fist?" "That is part of it." Harlan nodded slowly. He did not ask for another round. He did not offer his hand. He stepped aside. Chuck walked through the double doors. The hall stayed quiet until they closed behind him. Section 18. How the story spread. Only then did the Marines begin talking. Some repeated the throws. Some argued about the final combination. Some insisted Harlan had nearly ended it at the wall. Others remembered the moment Chuck told him to stand. The story spread across the base before the afternoon formation ended. By evening, men who had not been inside Combat Training Hall 7 already knew the outline. Chuck Norris arrived as a guest. Staff Sergeant Dax Harlan called his art a trick. Harlan demanded a real round. Chuck accepted. The strongest man in the room went down 3 times. The last time he could not rise on the first attempt. The details changed with each telling. Some said Chuck never moved more than a few inches. Some said Harlan had been thrown across the entire hall. Some said the final exchange lasted less than 1 second. The men who stood closest remembered something simpler. Chuck never fought the way Harlan expected. When Harlan used power, Chuck used angle. When Harlan used pressure, Chuck used timing. When Harlan used anger, Chuck used information. And when Harlan finally began fighting with discipline, Chuck was already too far ahead. Section 19. The morning after. The following morning, Harlan entered the same hall before sunrise. No unit waited for him. No commander watched. He stood alone on the mat. The room looked smaller without 200 Marines around it. He walked to the wall where he had pinned Chuck. He placed one forearm against the padding. Then he looked at his feet. Too wide. Too much weight forward. He repeated the position, shifted one foot, tried again. The first sergeant entered and watched from the door. Harlan noticed him. "You need something?" The first sergeant shook his head. "I wanted to see whether you were blaming the floor." Harlan looked at the mat. "Number? The rules?" "No." "The guest?" Harlan turned. "No." The first sergeant stepped inside. "Then what are you doing?" Harlan placed his foot again, watching what I gave him. The first sergeant nodded. That answer reached Chuck weeks later through a mutual acquaintance. Chuck did not celebrate it. He did not need Harlan to become a student. He did not need the base to declare Jeet Kune Do superior to every other method. The point had never been to create believers. The point was to remove certainty. Harlan had entered the hall convinced that anything demonstrated could not be real. He believed fame weakened proof. He believed a smaller man needed cooperation to look effective. He believed pressure solved every problem. The round removed those beliefs one by one. Section 20. What changed? Months later, Harlan was supervising close combat training with a new group of Marines. One recruit kept forcing the same takedown. Each time it failed, the recruit tried harder. Harlan stopped him. "What are you seeing?" The recruit looked confused. "An opening, Staff Sergeant." "No, you are seeing the opening you want." Harlan repositioned the man's feet. "Watch what he gives you." One of the older Marines heard the phrase and looked at Harlan. Harlan ignored him. He never told the full story during training. He never used Chuck Norris's name to make himself sound connected to something famous. But he changed three things. He stopped mocking methods before testing them. He stopped confusing aggression with control. And whenever a man became too certain, Harlan made him explain what he had actually observed. The scar on his cheekbone remained. The nickname remained. His authority remained. But the laughter was gone whenever someone mentioned Jeet Kune Do. Section 21. What the Marines remembered. Years later, a former Marine described what happened inside Combat Training Hall 7. He did not remember every punch. He could not repeat every sentence. He remembered Harlan standing at the back with his arms folded. He remembered Chuck looking small in the center of the room. He remembered the challenge, try it on someone who hits back. He remembered the first time Harlan went to one knee. He remembered the second throw. He remembered the final fall. Most of all, he remembered the silence when Chuck told him to get up. That was the moment the room understood the difference between defeat and humiliation. Defeat was falling. Humiliation was having every man around you see that your certainty had been false. Chuck did not need to insult Harlan. Harlan's own challenge had done the work. He had selected the rules. He had demanded the round. He had rejected the demonstration. He had promised that a real opponent would expose the trick. Then, before the same Marines who had heard every word, he had been unable to stand on the first attempt. Section 22, Closing Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, February 9, 1971, Combat Training Hall 7. Chuck Norris arrived as a guest known for Jeet Kune Do. Staff Sergeant Dax Harlan called it movie fighting. He demanded one real round. He wanted a man who would hit back. Chuck gave him exactly what he asked for. 3 minutes later, the strongest Marine in the room was on one knee admitting the truth in front of his entire unit. He had not exposed Chuck Norris. He had exposed himself.